I have an interest. How do we adapt? How do we make enterprise work better? How do we make people lives better in the
Right.
workplace?
I think that's exactly right, and I think there's one example that I kind of pointed out just on the like to wrap up the AGI side of things, right? Because people know about the Turing test, right? Of if I'm in a text conversation with some bot and it manages to convince me that it's a human, then we've achieved AGI. And I think there's a really simple example to point out actually why that's such a flawed test. Because you can imagine a very simple question: How tall are you? What color is your hair? Right? And then you immediately start to ask the follow up question: what is the right answer to that? Right? Is it supposed to have a particular body or not? Right? And you can think of, 1,000 very simple questions along those lines that I think just very quickly point out, oh, this idea of what exactly it is that makes human intelligence is really nebulous, very, very hard to pin down. And, we've been debating this for thousands of years. AI, I think, casts it in interesting light, but it's a sliver of additional information in thousands of years of inconclusive philosophical thought. So I don't think we're going
Exactly.
to solve it with
And
computers.
and just throw some fire on it, Slater. As a people, just in this simple conversational example you're giving, as people, we're almost calculating what's expected of us.
Hmm. Hmm.
The answers we give is not necessarily we just mechanically repeat what we know on the topic, right? We're
Right.
trying to please, or we're trying to, I don't know, conflict or some other agenda that we have. Do you know if AI can do that now?
Well, see, that's one of the things that's I think so interesting, right? And it's something that people circle back to again and again. It's this question of agency, right? Of ownership, of like, are you conscious of your space in the world? Or actually, sorry, let me maybe put that off to one
Mhm.
side because I think that's actually a little separate, right? But it's like, do you have your own desires? And I wrote this piece a little while ago about the existential crisis of AI, and I actually think this is sort of a fork. I think there's two camps here, and you don't see a lot of language about this. I think that it's only been very recently that AI has advanced far enough that there's a meaningful distinction. But I think there's two very different camps here, right? There's sort of the Bionicists, I'll say, right, and then there's the like Androidists. And very, very roughly, the idea is like, are you thinking about this as assistive technology, right? Or are you thinking about this as technology that is meant to replace people, right? That being an android and assistive technology being this bionic arm. And I think it really influences the way that you think about this AI technology very, very broadly. And that's the reason that I point at this question, how tall are you in the Turing test? Because in the Android camp, there is a right answer to that, right? And you should kind of assume, be an individual and attempt to replicate that, right? In the kind of bionicist, right, like bionic arm camp, right, where you're thinking about this as primarily an assistive technology, well, the Turing test doesn't even make sense, right? Why would you do that in the first place, right? The question is much more, okay, I want to benchmark some human machine system. And from my perspective, that's just a mental model that is much, much more productive. I think we're far enough from being able to replicate a human in its entirety in kind of that Android view that I just think the bionicist, kind of that bionic arm view, is much, much more productive, at least for the next decade.
So let's jump into some practical adoption of
Hmm.
fabulous technology that been proven. So
Yes.
skeptics seeing AI winter. All right, skeptics seeing, the loss of interest. Investors are more selective. You know how that goes. Not every shiny experiment now gets funded, right?
I mean, there was a lot of low quality stuff out there, I will say. I do not fault the investors for that.
Tell us more. Tell us more. What kind of high quality experiments that worth development? Developing it, throwing money at it, throwing people and people years in life of
Yeah,
work versus some of the
absolutely.
shallow. Yep. Mhm.
No, I mean, I think it happens with everything, right? The hype cycle, for all of its simplicities, there is an accuracy in it, right? And when all of these amazing, I think a lot of the first wave were these vision applications, right? Like really rich understanding on your YouTube videos. Some people might remember, a decade or so ago, right? Suddenly, all of that technology and like image search and whatnot got just like way better almost overnight, right? So that was kind of the first signal, and then that popped off a lot of other advances across language and whatnot. But as with all things, right, when you've got an initial advance, you've got a lot of people that will kind of flock to it and throw a lot of other mess around there, and they're was a lot of hype, right? I think if you look at the space that Indico is, and, I don't want to talk a huge amount about it as like pitch or anything, but in the unstructured space, if you look at the success rate, only about 50% of projects are getting into production at all. If you're looking at these AI projects, and then less than half of those are staying in production for a full year, right? And so in aggregate, right, these success rates are really, really bad. And I think that there is a very reasonable kind of pullback. On the flip side, and I think what makes us very different than a lot of earlier generations of AI winters, and why I wouldn't really say we're headed for that, is that there's tons of evidence, right? It's not like people invested a huge amount just speculatively and didn't get any return and no one has seen anything, right? It's like, no, like you see Google, you see Facebook, you see Microsoft, you see Tesla, right? Like people are doing this successfully, they're doing it at scale, and they are making money hand over fist doing it, right? And they're doing it in a lot of different domains. Even if you kind of expand out to the more, traditional AI kind of data providers like Databricks and Snowflake, right? They're very much a part of the space, right? Sort of selling picks and shovels, to use that metaphor. So there is success, there is gold out there. I think that is the distinction. I think that, certainly the macroeconomic conditions are really rough now for pretty much anyone in a growth stage. There's a lot of AI companies there. I think in the IDP space, there's already been some winnowing out, some shaking out. I think that's probably going to continue. But I think it's natural. I think ultimately it probably ends up being healthy. It's kind of the natural cycle of things. I don't see it as a winter impending. I see it as an overdue correction, and I just hope that things don't get chaotic. I guess that becomes a little bit of the problem, right? Because I think both valuations were ridiculously inflated, and then it was not. I mean, the war in Ukraine is like horrible and bad. Don't get me wrong, but it was not even just that macro shock, right? It was that plus like 3 or 4 other like massive global level macro shocks that were strangely interrelated at the same time. And while things seem like okay, and this seems, from one perspective, like a really, healthy, normal market correction, it's weird, right? I don't think there has ever been a situation like this, certainly not in my lifetime. You also see, again, just to name a couple of these things, these interest rates going up, right? And inflation in the state that it is. And it's just like, this has never happened before. And I don't think people really know what things are going to look like in 12 months. And so, I feel 80% sure, this is going to be a pretty normal market correction. But that 20% is real. And I don't know what it looks like in the alternative, right? But it's probably going to be strange in another market that looks unlike anything we've seen.